Hello and welcome to the 11th chapter in our online training about decision services. This is Richard from Intelligent Advisor IT Consulting. This chapter doesn't come with a demo, and indeed this chapter doesn't really tell you anything new. It simply reminds you of some key factors to keep in mind when working with decision services on the subject of versions. The agenda is simply to remind you about how decision services work in respect of the development cycle, which we'll call projects, and the deployment cycle, which we'll call deployments. We'll look at the different concept of versions. We'll look at how you commit a version, how you come back to an old version, and what it means to deploy a version. Again, simply to highlight things that you should take into account when building out a decision service strategy. During development, it's really very straightforward. You can access any development version through the REST API. As you will recall from our previous chapter, you can include the version number as well as the project name. On a more general level, it should be remembered that during development, you have a specific set of REST endpoints dedicated to accessing those versions during development. Thus, you can use actions run as REST. Run as REST is purely project-oriented and doesn't constitute a deployment. You can add your values, test your outputs. Indeed, in earlier versions, this was the only way to test the decision service before live mode became available. The default link when you use run via REST is as shown, but you can actually even replace it during the run via REST if you quickly need to access the run via REST interface for any of the versions that you've developed. Clicking the commit version button creates a version of your development and obviously creates, or rather refreshes, draft, so draft becomes the next version. So clicking commit creates another version number in your development history. Commit, commits, development versions. Only deploying will actually deploy anything. If you do deploy, then any unsaved changes in development will be committed to a new version, and then the process of deployment will begin. It's very important to realize that there are two separate strands here: project-based saves or commits and deployments. A feature that we didn't discuss, but I'm sure you'll be glad to know it exists, is during development, you can view any version you like. So in this screenshot, you can see I've selected version 35. You can tell it's an older version because the screenshot is clearly in read-only. And I can select revert to this version from the actions menu. When I revert to this version, the version is copied into draft. And you see this dialog, and I'll click revert. Moving away from development, when you are clicking the deployment process, when you're clicking deploy, you are essentially creating the second track. If you're familiar with how the repository works in Oracle Policy Modeling and to compare that to your deployment thread, you have a very good idea of how this works. Deployment also includes a feature that you will be familiar with in Oracle Policy Modeling, the Activate checkbox, which, just like Oracle Policy Modeling, is only available if you have a higher role. When you deploy and activate, if you have permission, then you are pushing a new version to the deployment strand. From within the deployment page of the hub, you can view the endpoints of the deployment. You can activate it and deactivate it, very similar to Oracle Policy Modeling, or indeed any other project. So the standard management tools are available for your deployed decision service, just like they would be for any other project. You can download a JSON file, you can view the endpoints, you can change the workspace, and any other setting you can see on the deployment page. And you can view the metrics. Moving back to Oracle Policy Modeling, recall that when you select a reference, you are referring to a decision service, and you cannot select a version here. You can only select either the development or the deployment branch. You are always selecting the latest version in both cases. There is no mechanism within a reference to refer to a specific version. This is an important distinction. So what have we seen in this brief chapter? We've reviewed and summarized the concept of the project strand and the deployment strand, which is very familiar to you if you've ever used the repository strand and the deployment strand in Oracle Policy Modeling. We've highlighted a couple of key points about versions, both accessing versions through the REST API and also when you create a reference. And as a we stopped off and mentioned, of course, that you can revert your development to an older version if something's gone very wrong. These are key points you need to keep in mind when you're developing your strategy and your best practices for how you will go about managing your decision services and deploying them. As I said at the beginning, there is no demonstration in this chapter because we were simply reviewing issues we'd heard of before. See you in the last chapter, which is coming up after.